We've all heard the stories of the Catholic Church, the soaring cathedrals, the saintly monks, the moral authority that shaped 1,000 years of Western civilization. But almost nobody talks about the uncomfortable parts, the parts hidden in the legal codes, the secret confessions, the rule books that governed every moment of life, right down to the marriage bed. We are told about piety and prayer. We are not told about the official handbooks that listed hundreds of sexual sins, each with a precise punishment, the court cases against priests who kept secret families, the nuns accused and locked away in stone cells. The church's war not just on heresy, but on human nature itself. Which of these are myths, and which are written down in ink and buried in the ground? Tonight, we open the books. We look at 5 cases, 5 documented practices that reveal a side of the medieval church you were never meant to see. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from historical penitentials like the Corrector of Burchard of Worms and the detailed visitation records of archbishops like Hughes of Rouen. Now back to the story. Number 1, the rulebook for sin. You're a farmer, a craftsman, a wife in the year 1010. You live in the Diocese of Worms in what is now Germany. Your bishop is a man named Burchard. He is not just a local cleric. He is a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, a legal scholar, a close advisor to Emperor Henry II. He is a man who builds fortifications and rewrites laws. And for 20 years, he has been compiling a book, a 20-volume monster that will define God's law on earth. It is his decretum. Inside, Book 19 is a direct address to you. It's known as the Correctoret Medicus, the Corrector and Doctor. It's not a book of gentle guidance. It is a surgical tool for the soul. It is a list, a detailed, obsessive, point-by-point catalog of every sexual act the Church considered a sin and the exact price you would pay. The book arms the priest in the confessional, turning him into an interrogator. He is instructed to ask, "Have you done what some women are accustomed to do?" They take a live fish and put it in their vagina and keep it there until it is dead. Then they cook it or roast it and give it to their husbands to eat, so that this will make them burn with greater love for them. The penance is precise, 2 years on bread and water. The book's logic was relentless. This practice wasn't just a sin of lust, but of magic, of trying to manipulate love which belonged to God alone. The questions go on, digging into every corner of human intimacy and desperation. Have you had an orgasm by yourself, by rubbing your own body, or with some instrument? The penance depends on your status. A layman pays with 20 days of fasting. A cleric, 30. A monk, 100 days. The book asks about contraception, a grave sin. Have you done as some women do when they have fornicated and wish to kill their offspring? They act with their magic and their herbs, or in some way, kill the embryo. The penance, 10 years of fasting and sorrow. This tradition of the penitential, the sin list, began centuries earlier in the windswept monasteries of 6th century Ireland, but Burchard perfected it. He created a standardized system of justice for sin. The artifact is the book itself, dozens of manuscripts surviving in libraries from Munich to the Vatican. They are the physical proof of a system designed to create and manage guilt on an industrial scale. In a world with few books, this one held ultimate power. The number that matters isn't just the years of penance, it's the number of questions. Over 360 detailed interrogations. The cold outcome was not just a hungry belly from fasting. It was a mind rewired to see sin everywhere, to believe that your most private self was a battlefield, and that the church was the only field hospital. Your soul was now an open book, and the priest was its only reader. Accused, catalogued, corrected. Number 2, the priest's secret. The year is 1123. In Rome, inside the Pope's own archbasilica of St. John Lateran, Pope Calixtus II convenes the first general council of the Church in the West. Hundreds of bishops and abbots gather under the painted ceilings. Canon 3 is read out. It is a declaration of war on a way of life. It reads, "We absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons to associate with concubines and wives." For centuries, this was the reality. In many parts of Europe, a priest having a partner was normal. These women were not seen as prostitutes. They were focariae, hearth keepers, the managers of the priestly household. In some regions, the relationships were sealed with contracts. The children were a common, if officially condemned, sight in villages. They often followed their fathers into the priesthood, creating clerical dynasties that kept church property within the family. But the great reform movement of the 11th and 12th centuries wanted this to end. The reformers, led by popes like Gregory VII, wanted a clergy that was pure, an elite spiritual army loyal only to Rome, not to wives and children. Their property, they argued, belonged to the church, not to a bloodline. The council in 1123 made it law. Existing clerical marriages were declared not just sinful, but non-existent. The women were to be cast out. The children were now officially bastards. But a law from Rome does not change a life overnight. Jump forward a century to the year 1248. Eudes Rigaud, the new Archbishop of Rouen in Normandy, begins a tour of his domain. He is a Franciscan, a reformer, and a meticulous record keeper. His diary survives. It is a stunning 350-page record of the gap between the law and the reality. He visits the parish of Etran. The priest, he notes, has a concubine and children. He is fined 20 shillings. He visits the priest of Bacqueville, a known fornicator. Suspended. He inspects the monastery of Saint-Lô. A prior is found with a woman hidden away in a secret chamber. He is removed. For 21 years, Eudes documented the failings of his clergy in relentless detail. In the year 1260 alone, he disciplined over 40 priests and monks for sexual offenses. These weren't isolated incidents. It was an ingrained system. To get around the law, many priests paid an annual fine to the bishop. It was an unofficial tax, a license to sin, sometimes called collegium. The church officially condemned it, but many bishops quietly pocketed the silver. The threat to power wasn't just sin, it was the public hypocrisy. It undermined the entire moral authority of the institution. The cold outcome was a world of ghosts. Children like Thomas, the son of the parish priest of Torigny-sur-Vire, who Eudes noted in 1252 could not legally inherit. Women who had built a life and a home, now with no legal standing, dismissed as whores. Men of God living a lie, their lives split between the sacred altar and the secret family hidden just down the lane. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from papal decrees, like those of the Lateran councils, and first-hand administrative accounts, like the Register of Eudes of Rouen. Now back to the story. Forbidden, fined, forgotten. Number 3, the walled-up woman. You are a nun in the 13th century. Your life is supposed to be a living prayer, a marriage to Christ. Your convent is a fortress against the world, a place of order, silence, and chastity. But many women were not there by choice. For a noble family with too many daughters and not enough dowries, the convent was a respectable solution. This meant that behind the serene walls, these communities could be rife with resentment, jealousy, and politics. And in this environment, an accusation of breaking the vow of chastity was a potent weapon. In 1281, in the German city of Erfurt, the Dominican friar Peregrinus of Oppeln compiled a collection of stories for sermons. One cautionary tale tells of a nun accused of being unchaste. We don't have her name. She is defined only by her accusation. The process was swift. An ecclesiastical court, run entirely by men, would hear testimony. The standard of proof was terrifyingly low. A manifest suspicion was often enough, or the word of 2 other nuns. There was no defense attorney. The accused had to prove her innocence against whispers. If found guilty, the punishment was designed to be a living death, a spectacle of deterrence. It was called immurement, being walled up. The guilty nun would be led to a small room, a cell, often built directly into the thick stone walls of the convent church. It was a tomb for the living. A small opening would be left, a lichnoscope or squint, just big enough to pass in bread and water and to allow the condemned woman to view the altar during Mass. She would live there, in the dark, in the cold, for years, sometimes for the rest of her life. She was physically and socially buried, a constant, silent reminder to her sisters of the price of transgression. The artifact detail is the anchorite's cell, which can still be seen in some old European churches, like the one at St. Helens in Skipwith, England. These were usually for voluntary recluses, but their design shows the grim reality. A stone box just big enough for a body. We have documented cases. In the Diocese of Lincoln, England in 1347, the records of Bishop Ginwell detail the case of a nun named Catherine of Belton from the local Cistercian priory. For her scandalous lapses, the bishop ordered she was to be enclosed, fed the bread of sorrow and the water of tribulation, and was to speak to no one but the prioress. The number that lands here is 1. 1 door, sealed with stone and mortar. 1 life, erased from the world. The cold outcome was absolute silence. The woman disappeared. Her name was struck from the records. Her sin was contained, and the convent's sacred walls were once again pure. Whispers, walls, silence. Number 4. The policing of the marriage bed. For the common person in the Middle Ages, the Church's most intense focus wasn't on bizarre heresies or clerical scandals. It was on your bedroom. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, on 1215, the same one that mandated annual confession for every Christian, solidified the Church's absolute control over marriage. And that control was incredibly specific, built on a theology of fear that went back centuries to thinkers like St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, had taught that Adam and Eve's original sin was transmitted generationally through the very act of sex, through the disordered lust, or concupiscence, that accompanied it. Therefore, even within a holy marriage, the act was tainted. It could only be redeemed, made licit by a single overriding purpose, procreation. Any other use, for pleasure, for comfort, for unity, was, at best, a pardonable sin, and at worst mortal. This idea was refined by later theologians like the great Thomas Aquinas, whose works in the 1260s and 70s became official doctrine. In his Summa Theologica, he laid out the rules. Not only was the purpose of sex restricted, so was the physical act. Based on a reading of natural law, there was only one proper position, the one they believed was most effective for conception and where the man was most dominant. Any other variation was deemed unnatural, a sin sometimes punished more harshly than fornication outside of marriage. These complex theological ideas were then simplified and passed down to the villages through confessors' manuals, books like the Summa for Confessors, written by Thomas of Chobham in England right after the 1215 Council. But the most shocking regulation was about time. The Church created a calendar of forbidden days. You could not have relations with your spouse on Sundays, not on Wednesdays or Fridays, traditional days of fasting, not during any major feast, period, the weeks of Easter, Pentecost, or Christmas, not during the entire 40 days of Lent, not during the season of Advent, not while a woman was menstruating, pregnant, or for 40 days after giving birth. When historians like Jean-Louis Flandrin added it all up, a married couple could be forbidden from intimacy for more than half the year, perhaps 200 days in total. This was enforced through the confessional. Once a year, you had to kneel before a priest. He could ask, "The artifact here is the marriage bed itself, transformed from a private space into a site of potential transgression, governed by a rule book written by celibate men." The cold outcome was a culture steeped in sexual anxiety. It tied one of the most basic human impulses to a constant, nagging threat of damnation, making every husband and wife into potential sinners. Duty, debt, damnation. Number 5, the holy test of chastity. There was an old, strange, and dangerous practice that haunted the edges of the early and medieval church. It was condemned again and again by the highest authorities, but it refused to die. It was called synesactism, or spiritual marriage. A priest, a monk, or a holy man, sworn to absolute celibacy, would take a consecrated virgin or a pious woman into his home. They would live together, eat together, pray together, and sometimes even sleep in the same room or the same bed. The stated purpose was to prove to the world and to themselves that they could conquer the temptations of the flesh through sheer spiritual will. It was a public performance of piety, a form of extreme asceticism, and it was an open invitation to disaster. The alarm bells were ringing from the very beginning. As early as 325 AD, the First Council of Nicaea, the same council that defined the core of Christian doctrine, issued Canon 3 to stamp it out. It strictly forbade any cleric from dwelling with a woman who was not a close, unimpeachable blood relative. Why? Because the bishops knew it would lead to scandal. They knew it tested a boundary that was bound to break. Yet the practice kept returning, a recurring nightmare for church authorities. In the 4th century, the great scholar St. Jerome had to flee Rome partly because of scandalous rumors about his intense, close relationships with the devout and wealthy women he served as a spiritual guide. But the most explosive case came later. In the early 1100s, a charismatic preacher named Robert of Arbrissel founded a new religious community at Fontevraud in France. It was radical, a double monastery for both monks and nuns, placed under the authority of an abbess. Robert practiced an extreme form of this spiritual testing. He reportedly slept in the common dormitory among his female followers, sometimes separated only by a curtain, sometimes not at all. He claimed it was a way to mortify his flesh and act as a spiritual father. His critics were horrified. The Bishop Geoffrey of Vendôme wrote him a scathing letter around 1100, accusing him of reckless pride. "You are making Christ's athletes into courtesans," he wrote. "While you presume to quell fleshly desires, you are stirring them up. The number that matters is the size of the community. Fontevraud grew to house hundreds of men and women, all living under this cloud of intense, self-inflicted temptation. The threat to power was the open mockery it made of the official doctrine of celibacy. If a priest needed a live-in test subject to remain chaste, how strong was the ideal to begin with? The cold outcome was the endless cycle of condemnation. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 banned it. Councils in the Carolingian era banned it. It was always banned, and it always came back because it spoke to a dangerous idea, that the line between extreme holiness and extreme sin was terrifyingly thin, tempted, tested, transgressed. These were not secrets in their time. They were the system, the rules, the very architecture of moral control. The penances were public knowledge, the court records were kept, the condemnations were read from the pulpit. But over centuries, this intricate, often brutal system of sexual regulation was smoothed over, forgotten, replaced by a simpler story of saints and sinners. Yet the evidence remains, buried not in myth, but in the archives and in the earth itself. In the year 2011, archaeologists from the National University of Ireland, Galway, were excavating at Kilty, the site of an early medieval monastery in County Roscommon, Ireland. They found the main cemetery, with orderly graves. And then they found something else, a separate burial ground, an unconsecrated plot just outside the sacred enclosure. Here, the burials were different. They found a staggering number of skeletons, nearly 400 individuals. A forensic analysis revealed something stark and deeply unsettling. Almost exactly half of them were neonates, newborn babies, dead at or around the time of birth. The site was active from the 7th to the 14th century, the very period when the rules of celibacy were being forged and the penitentials were promising damnation for contraception and abortion. Scholars debate the precise reasons for these bunawasht cemeteries, but the location is telling. It speaks to a reality that no official record would ever admit. The cold outcome of the secret families, the broken vows, and the terror of the confessional was not just a fine paid to a bishop. It wasn't just years spent on bread and water. For some, the price was absolute, a short breath, a shallow grave, a life that never was.